talking, like I said, not about a specific record group, but we're going to be talking about a method. So we can find our ancestors without going in circles. If we were here in person, I would ask for a show of hands, how many people have felt like they're going in circles trying to find their ancestors? But I have a feeling it's pretty close to unanimous. It's kind of a universal feeling that we have from time to time. So let's see how we can get past that. Because we're kind of led to believe that when it comes to genealogy, that it's a straight line, right? That it starts with find a record and then fill in the blanks. And we go and we look for records and we look for records and we look for more records. And what inevitably happens is that, pow, we come up against a brick wall. And sometimes it feels like we're just hitting our head against that brick wall all the time. Well, it really isn't a matter of finding more and more records. It isn't a matter of just going down that straight line, because that really isn't what the research process is like. If you're going to draw a diagram of the research process, it wouldn't be a straight line or an arrow. It would really look more like a spiral or a coil. As you follow it around, there are points where you start going down and some points where you're even going backwards, but then that sets you up to go forward and make more progress. And it's very cyclical like that. If you were going to think about the research process as going from point A to point B, it would be a lot less like walking straight down a busy city sidewalk. It would be more like a walk in the woods. And if you look at this man and child walking through the woods, and they're following this trail. And notice how this trail goes. It goes straight for a little bit, then it veers off to the left, it veers off to the right, but it's going to get them from where they are to where they want to be. And you might think of, well, if I'm trying to get from point A to point B, what do they say? The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But think about if they went in a straight line, if they're trying to get to the end of that trail, they're beyond those trees. If they go in a straight line, they're going to go down a ravine and they're going to end up, in rocks. There's probably a river down there and it just isn't good. But if they allow themselves to follow the trail, it's not a straight line, but it's actually the most efficient way of getting there, of going from where they are to where they want to go. And our research really is the same way. Our research usually is not a straight line. Our research really does what they're doing out here in the woods, and that is wander. And you might think, well, Amy, I don't want to wander. I mean, wander means to be lost. No, wander just means that you're not going in a straight line, that you're taking a meandering course, but you are getting from where you are to where you want to be. And wander can also be used as an acronym to describe the genealogy research process. Wander. WANDER. W, what are you trying to find? Analyze what you already have. Note what is missing. Discover new records. Evaluate everything, and repeat as necessary. Okay, so we have these 6 steps, Well, 5 steps and then a repeat is necessary if you want to be technical about it. So, how does this play out? How does the Wander method really play out in our genealogy research? Well, let's take a look at each of these steps at a little bit more in depth. So, let's start at the beginning with the W. What are you trying to find? You might think that this is a strange place to start, but really, figuring out what you want to find is key to having a good research experience. There are a couple of different ways that you can approach asking this, what are you trying to find? You might think about long term goals, or you might have specific questions. Now, long term goals can be good in helping us determine what we want to, you know, figuring out at least the beginning of where we want to start focusing. So let's say that we have some sort of milestone coming up in our family. Maybe there's a big family reunion coming up, and we want to trace all of the descendants of an ancestral couple. Okay. So that's kind of a large, sort of overarching long term goal. That's kind of a project. But really, when we want to get very efficient with our research, what we really need to be thinking about are specific questions, because these specific questions will really help to guide your research. You might think, well, don't I ask questions all the time? Well, maybe, maybe not. Because how often do you sit down, and I'm guilty of this, I'm including myself in all of this, but how often do you sit down and you say, I'm going to do research tonight? And then the next thing you know, it's 2:30 in the morning and you haven't really found anything. Well, if you don't know what you're looking for, that's when it starts to get even easier to get sucked down those rabbit holes. And you get distracted by all of the bright, shiny new databases that are out there rather than thinking about, okay, this is what I'm really looking for. But there's actually an art to asking a good research question. Because you might think, well, I want to find everything about John Johnson. Yes, I do have an ancestor named John Johnson. He's so much fun to research. And you might think, well, that's my question. I want to find everything about John Johnson. But this really isn't specific and it isn't a question. Okay, well, what if we get a little bit more specific? And this is something that I see a lot on social media. People will ask, and I am putting ask in air quotes there, they'll ask something like this. My ancestor was John Johnson, born in Canada. His wife was Eunice. He had sons Enoch and Eber and a daughter, Elizabeth. He's buried in Morgan County, Ohio. Well, it is more specific, but it still isn't a question. There is no question mark anywhere in this paragraph. So we still don't have a good research question. What is it we're trying to find? We have all of this information. My ancestor was John Johnson, born in Canada. Well, is your question, where in Canada was he born? Are we trying to figure out when John and Eunice were married? Are we trying to figure out when he came to Morgan County, Ohio? What is the question? Because that question is going to help us focus. So let's say that really our question isn't so much about John, it's really more about Eunice, his wife. Now let's say that that is my tree there on the right, and I've done a search on a, shall we say, rather popular genealogy website that begins with the letter A. And I go through their hints and I'm seeing all of these other trees that seem to match my Eunice, and they're all giving her the maiden name of Tingley. Well, I don't know Eunice's maiden name, but I'm seeing all of these trees that say that her maiden name is Tingley. Well, maybe my research question is, was Eunice's maiden name Tingley? Well, it is specific and it is a question. We do have a question mark in here finally, but there's something that I want to caution all of us when we're asking research questions. And that is to try to avoid something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, you might have heard of this. It's been in the news and sometimes you'll see it on social media. Somebody will mention something about confirmation bias, but really, what is it? So I found this definition that says that confirmation bias occurs from the direct influence of desire on beliefs. When people would like a certain idea or concept to be true, they end up believing it to be true. And further, this error leads the individual to stop gathering information when the evidence gathered so far confirms the views or prejudices one would like to be true. So think about how we ask our questions. Are we almost giving ourselves an answer when we ask the question? Because if we're doing that, we could be leading ourselves down the road of confirmation bias. And if part of confirmation bias is that we get to a point and, oh, okay, yeah, this thing that I already believed, this theory I already thought, oh, I found a couple things that support it, and then I stop. Well, that doesn't sound like a good research practice. So maybe instead of asking the question, was Eunice's maiden name Tingley? What if we make it a much more neutral question? What if instead we ask, what was Eunice's maiden name? Here we've taken our pet theory out of the question. So now we're not going to be quite as likely to just keep thinking, oh, well, this says Tingley and this says Tingley and this says Tingley. And pretty soon, I have these 10 sources that all say the same thing. They must all be right, right? Well, maybe not. So, like I said, there is sort of an art to asking a good research question, asking what it is you want to find. Well, let's think about a hypothetical research problem. And maybe I'm trying to find what is William's mother's maiden name. And here's where having that good research question can really help us. It can help focus us because now, when we have a specific research question, we can start to think about the records that are more likely to give us that information. So, things that are more likely to give us the maiden name of William's mother would be William's birth record, perhaps William's death record, his marriage records, and also those records for William's siblings. Now, of course, these are not the only records that William is ever going to create in his life, but they're not all going to answer, they're not all as likely to answer that question that we have. So, things that are less likely to answer this question, things like William's land records, his probate, his military pension. It's not to say that those records aren't valuable, and it's not to say that they aren't things that we shouldn't spend time looking for. But if we're focusing on trying to find William's mother's maiden name, looking at William's probate is not at the top of my list. So I can start to focus. Okay. I can kind of put the blinders on a little bit. And it's like, okay, later on, I'll look at William's probate. It's a wonderful record. I'm sure it has some great information in it, but it isn't probably as pertinent to the question I have at hand. Okay, so that was W. What do you want to find? Moving to A, analyze what you already have. Think of it this way. If You were going to get on a subway. Let's say you're in Washington, D.C., and you want to go to the National Archives. You're going to take the metro. You really do need to know where you're starting because different trains are going to take you to different locations depending on where you're starting from. It's the same with our research. How do we know what we need to do if we really don't have that good starting point? It really is like trying to give someone directions if you don't know what that starting point is. So think about in your research, what is your starting point? Because it's pretty rare to just be dropped in the middle of a research situation where you don't have anything about that person. What do you already know? What sources have you already gathered? When you're in this phase of analyzing what you already have, think about the types of records that you have, as well as their accuracy. So if you've gone through and you're analyzing and you thought that you knew that her name was Eunice, but oh, I'm looking at my sources and all I have are references to 17 other family trees. I think I need some other types of records in here. Or let's say that the only thing that you have is a death certificate and you're trying to answer something about the birth. Well, just like any other record, that death certificate really depends upon the knowledge of that informant. So, how accurate is it? Thinking about all of these things as you're analyzing to really get to that starting point. So, if we're thinking about our hypothetical situation of what is William's mother's maiden name, we go back through and we think about the types of records that could give us the answer. Well, William's birth record probably has his mother's maiden name on it, maybe his death record, maybe his marriage records, as well as records for his siblings. Well, do we already have any of these? It's amazing sometimes what we can find when we go back to our past research, because sometimes we've gathered records that either we forgot we had, or now that we are a more experienced researcher than when we first found that record, maybe we can read it with new eyes. We can pull more information out of it. So we really do need to go back. Do I have any of these records already? Well, let's say that the sources that we already have for this particular problem is we have William's death record, we have the record of William's first marriage, and we have a family history that somebody has compiled. Well, of course, with the death record and the family history, you have to wonder who gave that information. Would he or she have known what they were talking about? Okay. So if we have the record of William's first marriage, what about his other marriages? If your ancestor was married 3 times and you descend from the first marriage, well, those other 2 marriages could have information that is pertinent to that question that you're asking. So, okay, we have William's first marriage, but what about his other marriages? So, getting that really good starting point of analyzing what we already have. We also need to note what is missing. Now, when we're in the note what is missing phase, we need to think about not only sources that were missing, but also sources that could be improved. Because let's face it, not all sources are created equally. And there are going to be some records that we just haven't even gathered. Okay. But we do want to think about both the ones that are completely missing and the ones that okay, I do have a source for this, but I really could find something better. All right. So, thinking about those sources that we already have. Well, I already have William's death record, the record of his first marriage, and we have that family history. Noting what is missing. Okay, I don't yet have William's birth record. That would be a really good thing to find if I'm trying to find William's mother's maiden name. Again, we need to think about those records for his other marriages and those vital records for his siblings. Those are the things that are missing. But just as important, we need to think about the sources that we have that really could be improved upon. Now, a source is whatever you use to get information. Okay. And I think sometimes in genealogy, we do get a little wrapped up in, does this have sources or does it not have sources? Oh, this has sources. It's wonderful. Well, if a source is anything that you use to get information, I think if we really embrace that as a concept, that's going to help us realize that they are not all equal. Yes, we have these wonderful records that we find, like civil birth records, and we find baptism records and all these great things. But really, if you used someone else's family tree, that is a source because that's what you use to get that piece of information. So try not to fall into that trap of, I have 10 sources for this, therefore it must be right. Think about how those sources can be improved. If the source that you have is, you were interviewing Aunt Sally at the family reunion and she drew the family tree that took your lineage back to, you know, 1570, and she just tells you this, well, technically, Aunt Sally is your source of all that. But you probably don't want to trust Aunt Sally on all of that without having some other sources, right? So, really think about what you have and can you improve upon it? And really, really understanding the difference between just an index and an actual record. Because a lot of times, what we're seeing online really is not the actual record, it's just the index to it. And just like you wouldn't pull a book off the shelf, open it up to the back, it's like, oh, well, there's my ancestor's name, and it says my ancestor is on page 374. You wouldn't close the book and put it back. No, you would turn to page 374 and look up your ancestor. But how often do we find something online like this? Went on Family Search this afternoon, did a little search for William Kirk. Oh, wonderful. I found this quote death record for William Kirk. And it's giving me this wonderful bit of information that he died the 13th of June, 1941 in McCracken County, Kentucky. Awesome, great. But the problem is, this isn't William Kirk's death record. This is just an index to help us find it. Now, is his death certificate in another collection in Family Search? Maybe. Is it on Ancestry somewhere? Maybe. Do I actually have to contact someone at the McCracken County, Kentucky Vital Statistics Office? Maybe. But realizing that what you have here is not the actual record. And this really does fall under the note what is missing, because you don't, in this case, you don't have his actual record. You just have an index pointing you to it. Okay. And sometimes when we're looking on Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage or name your favorite genealogy website, we see a record like this and sometimes there's a lot of information on that page and we're pulling off, sometimes we're even pulling off parents' names or spouses' names or children's names. We're getting all this great information. How often, if there is an image there, how often do we take the time to click the image and actually look at it? What you're seeing on that page may or may not be right. It could have been indexed wrong. Somebody could have misread some handwriting. Someone could have misinterpreted something. And chances are, when you can get to the actual record, chances are there's a lot more information on that record than what is on that results page. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. Definitely think about those records that you have, those sources that you have that really could be improved upon. That falls under that category of note what is missing. Now, how do we do this? How do we note what is missing? Well, honestly, it comes down to personal preference. Thinking about how you organize information yourself. Now, how I organize things might be different than how you organize things. Do you think about things you like things in tables, or are you more comfortable with having things written out in paragraph form? Do you like having things handwritten, or do you prefer to keep things on a computer? And even if you're thinking about a computer, well, how are you going to do this? So really think about how you like to work with data, because that's essentially what we're talking about here. How do you like to keep track of what you need to do? You might keep a spreadsheet like an Excel file or numbers, or the spreadsheet in Google Docs, the Google Sheet format. Or you might prefer something like a Word document if you prefer things in paragraph forms. Personally, I love a good Excel file. I love putting things in tables so I can slice and dice. I can sort them however I want to. Some people really prefer Word documents. Some people prefer to come up with their own database. You might want to put notes in the note field in whatever genealogy software you're using, whether that's a tree online or if you have your own genealogy software like Roots Magic or Family Tree Maker. Sometimes just having a note on an ancestor's profile, like, remember, the next time you look at this, remember to go check out such and so. And some genealogy programs even have a to-do list or a task list built in, so you could keep adding to it right there in your genealogy software. You could use something like a task management or project management software. I know one piece of software, one app that's really popular is something called Trello. And it essentially acts like almost like a note board, like a bulletin board, where you can have different index cards and you can sort them and move them around, have them in different boards, thinking of them like different categories. So you could have different boards for different lines, or you could arrange them by location, thinking about specific research problems. So again, how you keep track of what is missing and what you want to go look for really depends upon how you are most comfortable. I will say this. Yes, there are a ton of different ways that you could do this. You could even just pick up a notebook and make notes in that. Nothing wrong with that. What I would advise you to do, though, is whatever method you start, keep it as simple as possible that is still effective for you. Because if your way of taking notes is so complicated and so cumbersome and so involved that every time you go to do it, you have to stop and think, now, how did I do that again? Believe me, if it's that complicated, you're not going to keep it up. So keep it as simple as possible. Kind of like doing source citations. Keep them simple, okay? Keep them simple, keep them effective, because the more you complicate it, the less likely you are to keep doing it. So finally, we're at the discover new records, because isn't this the part that we think of in research? Oh, we want to find more records. Well, we've got a good start now. We've asked that good genealogy question, what do we want to find? We have a good starting point by analyzing what we already have. We've noted what is missing and what can be improved. Now, let's go find some records that are going to help us fill in those gaps. When we're in this phase of discovering new records, well, we've really already created our to-do list by noting those records that are either missing or need to be improved. That really is our to-do list. Let's start with those. Again, the goal is to keep us focused. But as we're doing this, as we are discovering new records, make sure that you're keeping an eye open for what I call alternative or complementary records. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you have a civil marriage record. And by a civil marriage record, I mean that marriage record that is found in the county courthouse. The civil marriage record is the record that the government keeps. That could be in, depending upon the location, it might be in a probate court or a clerk of courts. It might be at a Bureau of Vital Statistics. But it's that record that the government keeps. That's the civil marriage record. Well, if you found that, is there also a church record? Take a look at that civil marriage record and note who it was who performed the wedding. If it says that he or she was reverend, or sometimes you will see after the name, you will see MG, minister of the gospel. You will see other, abbreviations like that, indicating that it's a member of the clergy. Now, if they were married by a JP, Justice of the Peace, well, that's not a member of the clergy, so we're not going to find a church record in that case. But just because you found this record at the courthouse, could that church record, that alternative or that complementary record, that other record could have more information than what you found at the courthouse? It might include the names of the parents, even if the civil marriage record doesn't. If we found a birth record, well, did those ancestors, were they affiliated with a church? And did that church practice infant baptism? If that's the case, is there a baptism record that we could look at? Who were the godparents? Who were the sponsors? We might be able to tie into other family members that way. So when we're looking in this discovery phase, this is discovering new records, what do we have, and pulling out as much information as we can to lead us into more records. Another example, let's say that you found the death certificate, and that death certificate lists where the person was buried. Well, okay, that's something else we can follow up on. Are there any cemetery records? I've seen cases where the cemetery records will list not only the parents' names, but sometimes more specific cause of death. Sometimes they will list even other family members who are buried in that same plot. So, not stopping with just that death certificate, but seeing what else can I discover based upon that, and thinking about those alternative or those complementary records. When we're thinking about discovering new records, I want us to think also about the methods that we're using to do our searching. Have we tried different search strategies? Or are we always using the same kind of search over and over and over? Have we tried search strategies like leaving out the first name? Have we tried search strategies where we have tried using wildcards if that particular website will let us use wildcards? And a wildcard is a certain character that will stand in the place of other characters. It's often an asterisk. So sometimes a website will let you use an asterisk, say at the end of a name, and that will help you pick up variations of how that name is spelled. So if you're researching a surname, someone with the surname of Daubenmeyer, okay, using a wildcard might be a good option because believe me, there are a ton of ways to spell Daubenmeyer. One of these days, I'm actually going to count all of the different ways that I have found that name spelled. So, have we tried different search strategies? Have we tried the strategy of looking for other people who should be in that record? Have we tried the strategy of going into a specific collection and not just having that broad, let's look at the entire website search? Have we gone into a specific collection? I know on Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage, a lot of websites will give you more search options when you're looking in a specific collection rather than doing that very broad federated search across the entire website. So think about how often have you changed up that search strategy. But also, when we're thinking about discovering new records, how often do we go out and have new places to explore? And I don't mean new places like going out and, your ancestors went from Fairfield County, Ohio to Jay County, Indiana. I don't mean like that. I mean, have you explored different places where those records might be? But I will say that when our ancestors have changed locations, we really do need to make sure that we are familiar with that area and what records are available. Researching in Jay County, Indiana is not the same as researching in Fairfield County, Ohio, which is not the same as researching Adams County, Pennsylvania, which is not the same as researching any county in New Jersey. We need to be familiar with that location. What records were created? When were they created? And in your handout, I have a link to a fantastic resource called the Family Search Research Wiki, which last I looked had more than 97,000 articles. So I don't think there are too many locations or genealogy topics that don't have at least a little bit of an article on the Research Wiki. But on there, you can find, okay, when did birth records start in this place? When did death records start? When did marriage records start? And oh, yeah, by the way, Licking County, Ohio, there was a courthouse fire. So you're going to be missing a lot of probate records. But oh, yeah, the probate records were destroyed, but the land records survived. So we can start to develop more of a strategy. But also thinking about not only about the research wiki, but getting off of just the big genealogy sites. Thinking about, and I say that because my next point is the Family Search Catalog. And you might think, well, Amy, that's still a pretty big website. Going into the Family Search Catalog can really give you some leads, can give you some avenues of research that you might not have known existed. You might not have realized that, oh, somebody back in the 1960s did abstracts of, the probate records for this entire county, and it's published in book form. Maybe that's something you can explore. But thinking about also things like genealogy societies, both those local ones and the state ones. If you're doing research with ancestors who identified strongly with a particular ethnic group, have you looked at ethnic genealogy societies? Because genealogy societies, especially the local ones, they really know the records. They know what records were created, and they know, just as importantly, they know where they are currently kept. And a lot of genealogy societies actually have resources on their website, even if you aren't a member. A lot of them will have at least basic research guides to get you started. So explore those genealogy societies, explore public libraries. Thinking about the public libraries that are in the location where your ancestors lived. Sure, your ancestor lived in a county, in the middle of nowhere, and you really don't have any plans on visiting that location anytime soon. But it's amazing how many public libraries have some sort of genealogy presence on their website. Again, it could be a, a resource guide, it could be a basic shelf list, it could be, hey, we have yearbooks from these schools for these years. You just never know what you're going to find until you go look. And again, thinking about those public libraries in the locations where your ancestor lived. Also thinking about state archives, state libraries, and state historical societies. You may not find the word genealogy on their websites, but going in, looking at their catalogs. Sometimes they'll be linked to something that has been digitized and online, oftentimes not. But even if it's something that is only in physical form, well, maybe you can go there and research it yourself. Or maybe you contact through the Ask a Librarian or Ask an Archivist function that a lot of the websites, a lot of these agencies have, and ask a very specific question. I did this not too long ago. I was researching someone who I discovered had died in the county home in Wayne County, Ohio, which is about 2 hours from me. Well, I wasn't going to be making it up to Wayne County anytime soon. So I discovered that there was a book that had been published about death records for the county home, and that's exactly what I needed. I found the book in a public library, and they had an Ask a Librarian function. So I used that function on the website. I said, I note in your catalog you have this specific book. I gave the title, gave the call number. I said, could you look up? And I gave the name of the woman I was researching and the date she died. So kept my question very short, very specific, right to the point. I immediately got a response that they acknowledged that they received my research request. And within a week, I actually had a digitized scan of the title page of the book and the page that the record was on that I was looking for. So use these other resources that aren't necessarily the big mega genealogy sites. Sometimes the best discoveries are made in that very local level. So take a look at all of those records as well. But that brings us up to the E in Wander, which is evaluate everything. Sometimes we think about evaluate and we think, oh, okay, well, we're evaluating these new records. And of course, we want to do that. Now, we've already evaluated those records that we already had. That was back when we were analyzing what we had. So we're evaluating these new records. We're thinking about their accuracy, but we also have to think about how they fit in with other records. Okay. How does it fit? Well, if we're thinking about our hypothetical question of finding what is William's mother's maiden name, and we had that death record that said it was Mary, the family history said that her first name was Mary. And then in that discovery phase, we found William's second marriage record, and all of a sudden it says Abigail Johnson. Okay, that's interesting because the death record and the family history both said Mary. So, what about Abigail Johnson? We have to think about how what we just found, how it fits in with everything else, because we don't want to fall into that bright, shiny, and new trap that, oh, this is that new thing that we found. We hadn't found the answer yet. This new thing, it tells us the answer, but is it really correct? Just because we have something that says, okay, this is what it is. If there are any conflicts with what we already had, we still have to go and resolve that conflict. We can't just say, oh, I found this brand new record. It tells me this, therefore it's right. And this can especially be a problem if we do have that issue of confirmation bias where we were already thinking one thing and then we stopped looking. Don't fall into this trap. Here's an example out of my research. I've been trying to determine the maiden name of Elizabeth Starkey, Starkey being her married name. So I'm going through the death records of her children. Now, obviously, I want to think about who is giving this information to sort of judge its accuracy. But if the first child, Leafy, on her death certificate, Elizabeth's maiden name was listed as unknown. Okay, well, that's not very helpful. But then I look at her other children, William, Oliver, Charles, and Celesta, and they all give me some sort of variation of Danoon. Variant spellings, but all basically the same name. Okay, this is awesome. But what if I keep searching for the rest of Elizabeth's children, including Andrew and Edward? Andrew's death certificate says Wilson, and Andrew's death certificate says Wilson, and Edward's death certificate says that her maiden name was Tompkins. Obviously, I have some conflicting evidence that I need to sort through. I can't just say, well, this most recent one that I found, it gives me the answer. It gives me an answer, therefore it's right. If there's conflicting evidence, I still need to resolve it. And that's going back and thinking about, okay, when was that record created? Who is giving the information? Has that source gone through changes? Are you looking at the actual record or are you just looking at the index? Again, thinking about this resolution of this conflict. Because we can't just say, well, 4 out of 6 death certificates that gave a name said Danoon, therefore it must be that. I think it was Tom Jones who said that genealogy is not a democracy. We can't just go and see which answer gets the most votes and say that that's it. Which leads us to the last part of the Wander method, and that is the R, repeat as necessary. Now, as you go through this, you might have found the answer. You might have found the record that it really does spell it out. You can tell it's a good, accurate source. And yes, it answered that question that you were asking. But sometimes it doesn't. And when that happens, we need to go back and repeat this process, repeat this method as necessary. And we might have to go back to any point in the process. You might have to go back to any point in the process. So, thinking about that situation that we've been thinking about of William's mother's maiden name, where the death record said married, the family history says married, the second marriage record says Abigail Johnson. Well, maybe we need to go back and analyze what we already have. Really, who did give that information for the death record? Maybe it turns out that it was William's grandchild. They would have no way of knowing who William's mother's, what her name was. And if the family history is just citing the death record, well, that's not like you have two different sources saying Mary. You really, in a way, only have one source. You just have one that's quoting the other one. So we have to go back maybe and analyze what we already have. Maybe we need to think about what are you trying to find? Because maybe you think, well, was William's father married first to Abigail? And this Mary that I keep seeing popping up, is she a second wife? And Mary is actually William's stepmother. Well, now we have a new research question. So we've gone back to what are you trying to find? Maybe we need to discover new records. Because remember, we had a whole nice long list of things that were missing, including those vital records of William's siblings. So we need to find, okay, we have William's siblings. We now need to find their birth records, marriage records, and death records. So going back to new research questions for them so that we can find those records. But it's all pointing back to that first question that we asked of what is William's mother's maiden name? We're keeping that question in mind. And we're asking these other questions, not just as random, yeah, that'd be kind of nice to know, but oh, wait a minute, I really do need to know this so that I can answer that question. So, like I said, the repeat as necessary could go back to any point in wander. What are you trying to find? Analyze what you already have. Note what is missing. Discover new records. Evaluate everything. And repeat as necessary. Wander. It doesn't mean that you're lost. It means that you're following a path that might not follow a straight line. But I have to tell you, if you allow yourself to wander, you can make some wonderful discoveries. And I think with that, I do want to thank everyone for being here this evening.